The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Raven's Hollow like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the ancient village that had seen too much sorrow. Alara pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the crumbling stone archway, her bare feet numb against the frost-kissed ground. The coarse rope around her wrists had rubbed her skin raw during the night, but she had learned long ago that crying out would bring no mercy, only more mockery from the villagers who had gathered in the square. The auction block stood before her like a monument to despair, its dark woods stained with the tears and blood of countless souls who had been broken upon its unforgiving surface. Market day in Raven's Hollow was always cruel, but today felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made even the boldest merchants speak in hushed whispers. Word had spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The Alpha King himself would be passing through their village. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the crowd gather. Their faces were a tapestry of anticipation and fear, eyes gleaming with the same hunger that had haunted her since childhood. She recognized each sneer, each whispered curse, each look of disgust that had followed her through 19 years of torment. The curse that stole her voice had also stolen her place in their world, marking her as something less than human in their eyes. "Bring forth the cursed one." Mayor Aldrich's voice boomed across the square, his jowls quivering with excitement. The fat man's eyes found hers through the crowd, and his lips curved into a cruel smile that made her stomach turn. "Let's see if anyone's desperate enough to take on such a burden." Two guards flanked Alara as they dragged her toward the platform, their grip bruising her already tender arms. The crowd parted before them like a sea of malice, and she could hear their whispered taunts even if she couldn't respond to them. "Look at the mute freak. Cursed by the witches herself. Not even worth the rope around her neck." Each word was a blade to her heart, but Alara had learned to let them pass through her like wind through empty halls. Her expressive amber eyes, the only voice she had left, swept across the crowd with quiet dignity. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not today, not ever. The rough wood of the platform scraped against her knees as they forced her to kneel. The iron shackles they clamped around her ankles were so heavy she couldn't have run even if the opportunity arose. But escape had never been an option for someone like her. A cursed Omega in a world that worshipped strength and despised weakness. "What am I bid for this pathetic creature?" Mayor Aldrich's voice carried across the square, dripping with false joviality. "She can't speak, but she can work. Perfect for the mines or the brothels. No complaints from this one." Raucous laughter erupted from the crowd, and Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks. She closed her eyes, trying to transport herself somewhere else, anywhere else. In her mind, she was running through the Silverwood forest, her feet light as air, her voice singing freely to the wind and trees. It was a beautiful fantasy, one that had sustained her through countless dark nights. 50 coppers, called out Merchant Gareth, a man whose wandering hands had made every woman in the village uncomfortable. 75, shouted Madame Roselle from the brothel, her painted face twisted with calculated greed. The bidding continued, each offer feeling like another nail in the coffin of Alara's hopes. She had always known this day would come, the day when the village finally decided she was more trouble than she was worth. At least in the mines, she thought with dark humor, she wouldn't have to see their faces anymore. But then, like thunder rolling across a clear sky, came the sound that silenced every voice in Raven's Hollow. Hoofbeats, the rhythmic pounding of dozens of horses approaching fast, accompanied by the distinctive jingle of armor and weapons. The crowd turned as one toward the main road, their faces draining of color as they saw the royal banners cresting the hill. Black and silver silk snapped in the wind, bearing the mark of the wolf, the symbol of the Alpha King himself. Alara's breath caught in her throat as the riders swept into the square like a force of nature. At their head rode a man who seemed carved from shadow and starlight, his presence so commanding that even the horses seemed to bow their heads in his presence. King Lucian Nightfall, the Wolf King, the Iron Fist of the Northern Realms. He was even more magnificent than the stories claimed. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his massive black destrier as if born to the saddle. His hair was dark as a moonless night, falling in waves that caught the morning light, and his skin held the bronze kiss of countless battles under foreign suns. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. silver like molten moonlight, ancient and knowing, holding depths of power that made her soul quiver with recognition. The crowd fell to their knees as one, pressing their faces to the cobblestones in desperate submission. Even Mayor Aldrich, for all his bluster, looked ready to wet himself as the king's gaze swept over the square. But those silver eyes, those impossibly beautiful eyes, found Alara kneeling on the auction block, and everything else seemed to fade away. Time stretched between them like a taut bowstring. She couldn't look away, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was something in his gaze that she had never seen before, not pity, not disgust, but something far more dangerous. Recognition, as if he had been searching for her across 1,000 lifetimes and had finally found what he was looking for. King Lucian dismounted with fluid grace, his boots clicking against the stones as he approached the platform. The crowd seemed to shrink back from his presence, their terror palpable in the morning air. When he spoke, his voice was low and rich, carrying the authority of absolute power. "What is the meaning of this spectacle?" Mayor Aldrich scrambled to his feet, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Your Majesty, we were simply conducting business. Market day, you understand. We had no idea you would be gracing our humble village. You were auctioning a person." The king's words cut through Aldrich's babbling like a blade through silk. "An Omega, by her scent." His eyes never left Alara's face. "What are her crimes?" "Crimes?" Aldrich's voice cracked. "Well, she's cursed, Your Majesty. Cannot speak. Useless burden on the village. We thought perhaps you thought to sell her like cattle because she cannot defend herself with words." The temperature in the square seemed to drop 10 degrees. "How civilized of you." Alara watched in fascination as the mayor's face cycled through several shades of panic. She had never seen anyone speak to the village leaders with such contempt, and certainly no one had ever defended her before. The feeling was so foreign it made her lightheaded. King Lucian stepped closer to the platform, and Alara caught his scent. Wild pine and leather, winter storms, and something indefinably masculine that made her wolf whimper with longing. When he extended his hand toward her, she stared at it in confusion. His skin was scarred from battle, marked with the evidence of a life spent fighting, but his fingers were long and elegant. "Come here," he said softly, and though his voice was gentle, it held the unmistakable tone of absolute command. Alara's heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone in the square could hear it. She lifted her shackled hands, gesturing helplessly at her bonds. A muscle ticked in the king's jaw, and when he turned back to the mayor, his expression could have frozen hellfire. "The key, now." "Your Majesty, surely you don't mean to—" "She's cursed. Bad luck follows her everywhere. The witches marked her when she was just a child, stole her voice, and—" The sound of steel being drawn from its sheath silenced every voice in the square. The king's sword gleamed in the morning light, its blade inscribed with runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner fire. He didn't point it at anyone, didn't make any threatening gestures, but the message was clear. "The key," he repeated, and this time Mayor Aldrich nearly tripped over himself in his haste to comply. The shackles fell away from Alara's ankles with a heavy thud, and she felt as if she could breathe properly for the first time in days. But when she tried to stand, her legs gave out from hours of kneeling. Strong hands caught her before she could fall, and she found herself looking up into those impossibly silver eyes from mere inches away. "Easy," King Lucian murmured, and his voice was different now, softer, warmer, meant for her ears alone. "You're safe now." Safe. The word was so foreign to her experience that she almost didn't recognize it. Her hands came up instinctively to rest against his chest, and she felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms. He was so warm, so solid, so real after years of feeling like a ghost haunting the edges of life. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. His thumb brushed across her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen, and the gentleness of the gesture nearly undid her completely. When had anyone last touched her with kindness? "What is your name?" he asked quietly. Alara's lips parted, and for one wild, impossible moment, she thought she might actually be able to answer him. The curse had been absolute for 19 years. Not a sound had passed her lips since the day the witch's spell had taken hold. But something about his presence, the way his wolf seemed to call to hers, made her feel as if she were on the verge of remembering something vital. Instead, she lifted her hands and spelled out the letters in the air, hoping he would understand. Elara, Elara, he repeated, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. Beautiful. The crowd began to murmur, their shock giving way to a mixture of confusion and outrage. How dare the cursed girl capture the king's attention? How dare she stand so close to him, touch him, look at him as if she were his equal? Your Majesty, Mayor Aldrich ventured, his voice oily with false concern. Surely you cannot mean to... She's damaged goods, cursed by dark magic. No good can come from... The king's head turned toward the mayor with predatory slowness, and the man's words died in his throat. When Lucian smiled, it was all sharp edges and deadly promise. Are you suggesting I lack the judgment to choose my own companions? No, of course not, Your Majesty. I merely thought... You thought wrong. The king's arm tightened around Elara's waist, drawing her closer against his side. Lady Elara will be accompanying me back to Shadowmere Castle. Anyone who has a problem with that arrangement is welcome to discuss it with my blade. Lady Elara, the title sent shockwaves through the crowd and through Elara herself. She stared up at him in wonder, certain she must be dreaming. Kings didn't rescue cursed Omegas from auction blocks. Kings didn't call village outcasts lady or look at them as if they were precious beyond measure. But his arm around her was real. His scent surrounding her was real. The way her wolf sang in recognition of his presence was devastatingly, impossibly real. Prepare a horse for Lady Elara, King Lucian commanded one of his knights. We ride for Shadowmere within the hour. As his men scrambled to obey, Elara felt the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her. The villagers who had tormented her for years were looking at her with expressions ranging from disbelief to rage to envy. She who had been the lowest of the low was suddenly being elevated beyond their reach, beyond their cruelty. But as the king helped her toward the horses, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a storm rather than away from one. Court politics were surely more dangerous than village gossip. What would happen when the other nobles learned that their king had claimed a cursed, voiceless Omega? More troubling still was the way her body responded to his nearness, the way her wolf whimpered with need every time he looked at her. She had heard the stories of true mates, of bonds that transcended reason and defied explanation. But surely such tales were just fantasy. Yet as King Lucian lifted her onto the horse, his hands lingering at her waist longer than strictly necessary, Elara felt something deep inside her chest crack open. A door that had been sealed for 19 years was beginning to strain against its hinges. Hold tight to me, he murmured, as he swung up behind her, his chest solid and warm against her back. It's a long ride to Shadowmere, but I promise you'll be safe. As the horses began to move, carrying her away from the only life she had ever known, Elara closed her eyes and tried to quiet the chaos in her mind. The curse that had stolen her voice was still there, still as strong as ever. But for the first time in her life, she felt a tiny spark of hope kindling in her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, her story was finally beginning. The journey to Shadowmere Castle took 3 days through terrain that grew progressively more wild and untamed. Elara had never traveled beyond the borders of Raven's Hollow, and each mile they covered revealed wonders that stole her breath. Ancient forests where the trees grew so tall their crowns disappeared into mist, crystal streams that sang with voices older than memory, and mountains that scraped the belly of the sky with their jagged peaks. But it was the castle itself that nearly stopped her heart. Shadowmere rose from the mountainside like something born from the stone itself, its black towers reaching toward the storm-dark sky with predatory grace. The fortress was massive beyond comprehension, its walls thick enough to withstand the siege of gods, its battlements bristling with enough weapons to level armies. But despite its martial appearance, there was an undeniable beauty to the place. Elegant arches that caught the light like captured starfire, gardens that cascaded down the mountainside in verdant waterfalls, and windows that gleamed like watchful eyes in the gathering dusk. Welcome to your new home, King Lucian's voice was warm against her ear, his breath stirring the loose tendrils of her hair. They had ridden together for 3 days, her body pressed against his chest, and each hour had only deepened the strange connection she felt to him. His scent had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, his presence as necessary as breathing. But as they approached the main gates, Alara felt her courage beginning to falter. The guards who watched from the battlements were not village watchmen with soft bellies and softer resolve. These were warriors forged in battle, their eyes sharp as winter steel, their bodies honed to deadly perfection. And beyond those gates waited the nobility of the northern realms, people who would see her muteness not as a tragic curse, but as a sign of weakness to be exploited. The massive portcullis groaned upward as they approached, revealing a courtyard that could have housed the entire village of Ravens Hollow. Servants and nobles alike had gathered to welcome their king home, but Alara could feel their curious stares burning into her like brands. She pulled her tattered cloak closer around her shoulders, suddenly hyper-aware of how she must look. A dirty, voiceless peasant girl clinging to their magnificent king like some pathetic stray. "Steady," Lucian murmured, his arm tightening around her waist. "Let them look. Let them wonder. You belong here as much as any of them." But did she? Alara's amber eyes swept across the assembled crowd, taking in the rich fabrics, the gleaming jewels, the perfectly coiffed hair and painted faces. These people moved through life with the confidence that came from never doubting their place in the world. She, meanwhile, had spent 19 years learning to make herself invisible, to take up as little space as possible lest she draw unwanted attention. King Lucian dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. The moment her feet touched the cobblestones, she felt exposed, vulnerable. Without his solid presence at her shrine, the weight of 100 stairs became almost unbearable. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She caught fragments of whispered conversations, speculation about who she was and why their king had brought her here. "Your Majesty," a woman's voice cut through the whispers like a blade through silk. "What an unexpected guest." Alara turned to see a vision of aristocratic perfection approaching them. The woman was tall and willowy, her silver blonde hair swept up in an elaborate style that must have taken hours to achieve. Her gown was the deep blue of midnight sky, cut to emphasize every curve and edge of her flawless figure. But it was her eyes that made Alara's blood run cold, ice blue and calculating, holding the kind of intelligence that could dissect a person's weaknesses with surgical precision. "Lady Vivian," King Lucian's voice was politely neutral, but Alara caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. "Allow me to present Lady Alara. She will be staying at Shadowmere as my personal guest." Lady Vivian's perfect eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "How charitable of you, Your Majesty, though I confess she appears rather travel-worn. Perhaps she would benefit from a bath and some proper attire before joining civilized company." The words were spoken with a smile, but the insult was clear enough. Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She wanted to defend herself, to match Lady Vivian's elegant cruelty with wit of her own, but the curse held her tongue as surely as iron chains. "Lady Alara has endured a difficult journey," the king replied, his tone carrying a warning that made several nearby nobles take a step backward. "I'm sure she will appreciate your concern. In the meantime, she will be given chambers in the royal wing, befitting her status as my honored guest." The royal wing. Alara saw shock ripple through the assembled crowd like stones thrown into still water. She herself could barely process the words. The royal wing was reserved for visiting monarchs, potential brides, and the most important dignitaries in the realm. For a voiceless peasant girl to be housed there was unprecedented, scandalous. "Of course, Your Majesty." Lady Vivian's smile never wavered, but her eyes promised retribution. "How thoughtful of you to provide such appropriate accommodations." King Lucian offered Alara his arm, and she took it gratefully, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. As they walked through the crowd toward the castle's main entrance, she kept her chin raised and her back straight, refusing to give Lady Vivian or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her cower. The interior of Shadowmere was even more magnificent than its exterior. Soaring ceilings supported by carved pillars that resembled ancient trees, tapestries that depicted the legendary deeds of the Wolf Kings, and everywhere the soft glow of enchanted crystals that bathed everything in warm golden light. Alara had to resist the urge to gawk like a village simpleton, though her wide eyes must have betrayed her wonder. "The castle has been in my family for over 1,000 years," Lucian explained as they walked through corridors wide enough to accommodate armies. "Each generation has added their own touches, but the heart of it remains unchanged. It's a place of power, yes, but also of sanctuary. I want you to think of it as your home now." Home, the word was almost too beautiful to believe. Alara had never truly had a home. The cottage where she had lived with her guardian was more prison than sanctuary, and the village had always made it clear she was unwelcome. But this place, with its ancient stones and whispered legends, felt different. There was magic here, old and deep and patient. She could feel it in the very air she breathed. They climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to wind up into the very heart of the castle, passing windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains and forests. Finally, they stopped before a set of double doors carved with intricate wolf motifs. "Your chambers," King Lucian said, pushing the doors open to reveal a suite that was larger than most houses in Raven's Hollow. Alara stepped inside and felt her breath catch in her throat. The sitting room was dominated by a massive fireplace where a cheerful blaze crackled and danced. Rich carpets covered floors of polished stone, and comfortable furniture, upholstered in deep jewel tones, invited relaxation. Through an archway, she could see a bedchamber with a four-poster bed that could have accommodated a small family, and beyond that, hints of a bathing chamber that promised hot water and scented oils. But it was the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows that truly stole her breath. The chambers overlooked the Silverwood Forest, the same forest where she had dreamed of running free during her darkest moments in Raven's Hollow. From here, she could see the canopy stretching away toward distant horizons, painted in shades of green and gold that seemed to shift and dance in the afternoon light. "Do you like it?" The question was asked quietly, almost hesitantly, and when Alara turned, she saw something vulnerable in the king's silver eyes. She nodded emphatically, then pressed her hands to her heart and gestured toward him, trying to convey the depth of her gratitude. How could she make him understand what this meant to her? How could she express that for the first time in her life she felt truly safe? King Lucian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker silver in his eyes, could count the faint scars that marked his throat and jaw. When he reached out to cup her face in his hands, she leaned into the touch instinctively, her eyes fluttering closed at the warmth of his palms against her skin. "I want to hear your voice," he whispered, and the raw longing in his tone made her heart clench painfully. "I want to know your thoughts, your dreams, your fears. I want to know everything about you, Alara." Her eyes opened, meeting his gaze with all the pain and hope and desperate yearning that lived in her heart. If she could speak, she would tell him that she had dreamed of him long before they met, a faceless savior who would see past her curse to the woman beneath. She would tell him that his touch made her feel whole in a way she had never experienced, that his presence quieted the howling loneliness that had been her constant companion. Instead, she could only reach up and trace the strong line of his jaw with trembling fingers, hoping her touch could convey what her voice could not. For a moment, they stood frozen in that tableau, king and peasant, alpha and omega, two souls recognizing something profound and terrifying in each other. The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility, with the weight of unspoken words and unfulfilled promises. Then, from somewhere deep in her chest came a sound that shattered the silence like breaking glass. A whisper, barely audible, rough from disuse, but unmistakably a voice. Her voice, "Thank you." The words hung in the air between them like a miracle, and Alara's hands flew to her throat in shock. Had she truly spoken? After 19 years of silence, had his presence somehow cracked the curse enough to let two precious words escape? King Lucian's eyes went wide, then blazed with an intensity that made her knees weak. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, and she could see that his hands were trembling. "Say it again," he commanded, his voice hoarse with wonder and desperate hope. Alara opened her mouth, tried to force another sound past the barrier that had held for so long, but found only silence. The curse snapped back into place like a door slamming shut, leaving her mute once more. Tears of frustration spilled down her cheeks, and she shook her head helplessly. "It's all right," Lucian soothed, gathering her against his chest and pressing his lips to the crown of her head. It's a beginning, Alara. The curse is weakening. I felt it break, just for a moment. She clung to him, breathing in his scent, letting his strength anchor her in a world that suddenly felt full of impossible possibilities. 2 words. She had spoken 2 words. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely more than she had managed in 19 years. A sharp knock at the door broke the spell between them. King Lucian released her reluctantly, his expression darkening as he called out, "Enter." A servant girl appeared in the doorway, her eyes carefully averted from the intimate scene she had interrupted. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Commander Aldrich requests your immediate presence in the war room. There has been an incident along the eastern border." The king's jaw tightened, and Alara could see the shift in him from lover to monarch, from the gentle man who had held her so tenderly to the fierce warrior who ruled a kingdom with an iron fist. "Tell Aldrich I'll be there presently," he said curtly. The servant curtsied and withdrew, closing the door behind her with a soft click. When he turned back to Alara, his expression was torn between duty and desire. "I have to go. The kingdom requires my attention, and I cannot ignore threats to my people's safety." She nodded, understanding. She had seen enough of leadership in Ravenshollow to know that power came with responsibilities that could not be set aside for personal desires, no matter how compelling. "But I'll return as soon as I can," he promised, taking her hands in his. "In the meantime, there will be servants to attend to your needs. Bathe, rest, eat something substantial. Tomorrow we'll begin working on breaking that curse properly." The way he said it with such casual confidence made her heart race. He spoke as if her freedom from the curse were not a matter of if, but when. After years of hopelessness, such certainty was intoxicating. He pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead, and she felt the wolf inside her purr with contentment. When he finally pulled away and strode from the room, she felt the loss of his presence like a physical ache. Alone in her magnificent chambers, Alara sank into one of the plush chairs before the fireplace and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she had been a captive awaiting auction, resigned to a life of slavery or worse. Now she was housed in a royal palace, claimed by a king who seemed to see something in her that no one else ever had. More importantly, she had spoken. 2 words whispered in his presence had broken free from the prison of silence that had held her for so long. The curse was still there. She could feel its weight pressing down on her throat like iron bands, but it had cracked. And if it could crack once, perhaps it could shatter entirely. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see a trio of servant women entering with armfuls of clothing and toiletries. They moved with practiced efficiency, preparing a hot bath in the adjoining chamber while laying out garments that looked fit for a queen. "Begging your pardon, my lady," the eldest of the servants said with a respectful curtsy, "but His Majesty has instructed us to see to your comfort. I am Marta, and these are my assistants, Rose and Lily. We are at your service for as long as you require." Alara rose and offered them a graceful bow of her head, hoping they would understand her gratitude, even if she couldn't voice it. The women smiled warmly, seemingly unbothered by her silence. "Come then, my lady," Marta continued. "Let's get you properly bathed and dressed. The king wishes you to dine with him this evening, and we want you looking your finest." Dine with him? The thought sent butterflies dancing in her stomach. She had barely managed 2 words in his presence. How would she navigate an entire meal surrounded by the scrutiny of the court? But as the servants helped her toward the bathing chamber, where steam rose from a tub filled with water that smelled of lavender and roses, Alara felt a spark of determination kindle in her chest. She had survived 19 years of cruelty and isolation. She had endured the loss of her voice, her place in the world, her very identity. She would not be cowed by a few aristocrats with sharp tongues and sharper ambitions. King Lucian had seen something in her worth saving, worth claiming, worth protecting. Perhaps it was time she started seeing it too. As she sank into the blissfully hot water and felt the grime and despair of her old life washing away, Alara made herself a promise. She would find her voice again, no matter what it took. And when she did, she would use it to thank the man who had given her back her humanity. The curse had stolen 19 years from her. It would not steal one moment more. The evening gown laid out for Alara was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and hold starlight in its depths. The fabric moved like liquid shadow as Marta and her assistants helped her into it, the bodice fitting her slender frame perfectly while the flowing skirt made her feel like she was wearing a piece of the night sky itself. They had braided her long auburn hair into an elaborate crown atop her head, weaving tiny silver ornaments through the strands that caught the light with every movement. When she looked at herself in the full-length mirror, Alara barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the ragged peasant girl in tattered clothing. In her place stood someone who looked as if she belonged in these magnificent halls, someone who might actually be worthy of a king's attention. "You look beautiful, my lady," Rose said softly, adjusting the delicate silver necklace that graced Alara's throat. The pendant was a wolf's head carved from moonstone, its eyes set with tiny diamonds that sparkled like stars. "His Majesty chose this himself, said it would complement your eyes." Alara touched the pendant reverently, feeling the smooth stone warm beneath her fingers. Even when duty had called him away, King Lucian had been thinking of her, choosing jewelry that would make her feel beautiful and protected. The gesture sent warmth spreading through her chest like honey. A knock at the door announced the arrival of her escort for the evening, a young knight with kind eyes and an easy smile who introduced himself as Sir Marcus. He was handsome in a boyish way that might have caught her attention under other circumstances, but after experiencing the raw magnetism of the Alpha King, every other man seemed pale and insubstantial by comparison. "Lady Alara," Sir Marcus said with a respectful bow, "His Majesty has asked me to escort you to the Great Hall. If you're ready?" She nodded gracefully, accepting his offered arm with what she hoped was appropriate dignity. As they walked through the corridors of Shadowmere, she tried to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. The servants had spent the afternoon teaching her the basics of court etiquette, which fork to use for which course, how to sit with perfect posture, how to navigate conversations when one could not speak. But knowing the rules and executing them flawlessly under scrutiny were two very different things. The Great Hall was a cavern of golden light and whispered conversations, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows high above. Massive tapestries depicting the legendary hunts of ancient wolf kings adorned the walls, and hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across faces both beautiful and calculating. The nobility of the northern realms had gathered in their finest attire, the men resplendent in doublets of rich velvet and silk, the women glittering with jewels that cost more than entire villages. But it was the man seated at the head of the high table who drew every eye in the room. King Lucian had changed from his traveling clothes into formal court attire, and the transformation was breathtaking. His doublet was black as a moonless night, embroidered with silver thread and patterns that seemed to shift and move in the candlelight. A circlet of silver and obsidian rested on his dark hair, the ancient crown of the Wolf Kings that had graced the heads of his ancestors for 1,000 years. But it was his eyes that truly commanded attention, those mercury silver orbs that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the very soul beneath. When his gaze found hers across the crowded hall, everything else faded away. The conversations became distant murmurs, the glittering nobility mere shadows at the periphery of her vision. He rose from his chair with fluid grace, and she saw his lips curve in the faintest of smiles, an expression meant for her alone. "Lady Alara has arrived, Your Majesty," Sir Marcus announced as they approached the high table, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed hall. "So I see," King Lucian replied, his voice warm with approval as his eyes took in her transformation. He stepped down from the dais and offered her his hand, the gesture both courtly and possessive. "You look magnificent." Heat rose in Alara's cheeks at the compliment, and she felt the weight of dozens of stares pressing down on her. She could practically hear the wheels turning in aristocratic minds. Who was this mysterious woman who had captured their king's attention so completely? What power did she possess that could make the most eligible ruler in the known world look at her as if she were the only person in the room? King Lucian led her to the chair at his right hand, a position traditionally reserved for queens and honored guests of the highest rank. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present, and Alara heard the sharp intake of breath from Lady Vivian, who was seated several places down the table with a smile that could have frozen wine. "My lords and ladies," The king addressed the assembled nobility as servers began bringing forth the first course. Tonight we welcome Lady Alara to Shadowmere. I trust you will all extend to her the courtesy and respect befitting an honored guest of the crown. The words were spoken pleasantly enough, but there was steel beneath the silk, a clear warning that any discourtesy toward Alara would be considered a personal insult to the king himself. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall, though Alara could see the speculation burning in dozens of pairs of eyes. The first course was a delicate soup seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, served in bowls so fine they were nearly translucent. Alara ate carefully, hyper-aware that every movement was being watched and judged. Beside her, King Lucian kept up a steady stream of quiet conversation, describing the dishes being served and pointing out various nobles around the hall. "The man with the ridiculous feathered hat is Lord Garrett of Eastmarch," he murmured, leaning close enough that his breath stirred the tendrils of hair at her ear. "He owns half the grain fields in the kingdom but has the personality of wet parchment. The woman beside him is his wife, Lady Catherine, who collects gossip like other people collect coins." Despite her nervousness, Alara found herself smiling at his dry commentary. There was something wonderfully irreverent about the way he described his own nobles, as if he saw through all their pretensions to the petty, flawed humans beneath. "And Lady Vivian?" she wanted to ask, but of course the words remained trapped behind the barrier of her curse. Instead, she glanced meaningfully toward the silver-blonde woman who was holding court at the far end of the table, her musical laughter carrying clearly across the hall. King Lucian's expression darkened slightly. Lady Vivian Ashford, daughter of the Duke of Winterhold, beautiful, intelligent, ambitious, and utterly without scruples. She has been angling to become my queen since she came of age, using every weapon in her considerable arsenal to catch my attention. There was no warmth in his voice when he spoke of Lady Vivian, but Alara couldn't shake the feeling that such a formidable opponent would not be easily discouraged. The woman was everything Alara was not: noble-born, articulate, confident in her place in the world. What could a cursed peasant girl possibly offer that such a paragon could not? As if sensing her troubled thoughts, King Lucian's hand found hers beneath the table, his fingers interlacing with her own in a gesture that was both comforting and possessive. His thumb traced gentle circles across her knuckles, and she felt some of her tension ease at the contact. The conversation around the table had turned to matters of state. Reports from the eastern border, where raiders had been testing the kingdom's defenses, trade negotiations with the southern kingdoms, the always delicate balance of power between the noble houses. Alara listened with growing fascination, realizing that ruling a kingdom was far more complex than she had ever imagined. Every decision carried consequences that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, affecting thousands of lives in ways both seen and unseen. "The Blackwood Pack has been growing increasingly aggressive," Lord Commander Aldrich was saying, his weathered face grim in the candlelight. "3 villages attacked in the past month, their stores raided and their young carried off. If we don't respond soon, other packs may see it as weakness." "The Blackwood Alpha is testing me," King Lucian replied, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "He thinks that because I am still unmated, still without an heir, I am vulnerable to challenge. He forgets that I have held this throne through strength, not bloodline alone." "Perhaps," Lady Vivian interjected smoothly, her voice honey-sweet with calculated innocence, "the solution lies not in warfare, but in alliance. A strategic marriage to unite the packs, to show them that the Wolf King is not alone, but commands the loyalty of powerful allies." The suggestion hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, and Alara felt her heart stutter in her chest. Lady Vivian's meaning was clear. She was positioning herself as the solution to the kingdom's problems. The perfect queen who could bring political advantages along with her beauty and breeding. King Lucian's hand tightened around Alara's, a subtle reminder of his presence and protection. When he spoke, his voice was cold as winter wind. "I have no intention of marrying for political convenience, Lady Vivian. When I take a queen, it will be because I have found my true mate, the one person in all the world who completes my soul. No alliance, however advantageous, is worth sacrificing that bond." The rebuke was delivered with such finality that even Lady Vivian's perfect composure cracked slightly, but Alara could see the fury burning behind those ice-blue eyes, the promise of retribution for this public humiliation. She had made an enemy tonight, one with the resources and motivation to cause considerable harm. As the evening progressed, Alara found herself relaxing despite the undercurrents of tension swirling through the hall. King Lucian was an attentive companion, ensuring her glass was never empty and her plate never lacking. He continued his whispered commentary about the various nobles, painting vivid pictures of their personalities and foibles that had her biting back smiles. But it was during a lull in conversation, when most of the nobles were focused on the elaborate dessert course, that disaster struck. Lord Garrett, perhaps emboldened by wine and Lady Vivian's earlier boldness, leaned forward in his chair and addressed Alara directly. "Tell me, Lady Alara," he said loudly enough for half the table to hear, "what brings you to Shadowmere? His Majesty has been quite mysterious about your origins." The question hit her like a physical blow. Every face at the table turned towards her expectantly, waiting for her response. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, becoming more awkward with each passing second. Alara felt heat flood her cheeks as panic clawed at her throat, the familiar weight of her curse pressing down like iron chains. She opened her mouth, desperate to speak, to offer some explanation that would satisfy the curious nobles. But no sound emerged, not even the faintest whisper. The curse held her fast, as immovable as mountains, as absolute as death itself. The silence became crushing. She could see confusion dawn on faces around the table, followed quickly by realization and barely concealed disgust. A few nobles exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to calculation as they processed this revelation. "The lady appears to be indisposed," Lady Vivian observed with false concern, her voice carrying clearly in the deadly quiet. "Perhaps she is unwell?" It was masterfully done, the suggestion delivered with such apparent sympathy that it couldn't be called an attack, yet devastating in its implications. A queen who could not speak, could not command, could not defend herself with words, was no queen at all. Alara felt tears of humiliation burn behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had endured worse than this, years of mockery and cruelty that had forged her spirit in fires far hotter than aristocratic disdain. She would not break now, not when King Lucian had shown such faith in her, but it was the king himself who shattered the suffocating silence, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Lady Alara was cursed as a child," he said calmly, his tone brooking no argument or discussion. "Dark magic stole her voice, but not her intelligence, her compassion, or her strength. Anyone who mistakes silence for weakness will find themselves gravely mistaken." The words were spoken with such quiet authority that even the most skeptical nobles fell silent. But Alara could see that the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, watered with aristocratic prejudice and social expectation. How could a voiceless woman rule alongside the most powerful king in the known world? The remainder of the dinner passed in a blur of forced politeness and carefully neutral conversation. When King Lucian finally rose and announced that the evening was at an end, Laura felt nothing but relief. She had survived her first trial by fire, but just barely. As the nobles began to file out of the great hall, offering perfunctory bows and curtsies to their king, Lady Vivian approached with feline grace. Her smile was razor-sharp, her eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "Such an educational evening," she purred, her gaze fixed on Alara with predatory intensity. "I do hope Lady Alara won't find court life too challenging. We wouldn't want her to feel overwhelmed." Each pause was a carefully placed barb, designed to cut without seeming overtly hostile. But King Lucian stepped smoothly between them, his presence a wall of protective fury that made Lady Vivian take an involuntary step backward. "Lady Vivian," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made the temperature in the hall seem to drop 10 degrees. "I trust you will make Lady Alara feel welcome at Shadowmere. After all, guests under my personal protection tend to be quite safe from any unpleasantness." The threat was delivered with such casual elegance that Lady Vivian's perfect mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating predator beneath. But she recovered quickly, offering a curtsy that was just deep enough to avoid being insulting. "Of course, Your Majesty, I live only to serve the crown." When she glided away, her silk gown whispering against the stone floor, Alara felt as if she had just witnessed a declaration of war. Lady Vivian would not forget tonight's humiliation, and she would not forgive the woman who had caused it. "Come," King Lucian murmured, offering Alara his arm. "Let me escort you back to your chambers. We have much to discuss." As they walked through the corridors of Shadowmere, Alara's mind churned with everything that had happened. The evening had been a disaster. She had been exposed as voiceless before the entire court, humiliated by her inability to defend herself or contribute to the conversation. How could King Lucian still look at her with such warmth, such unwavering faith? When they reached her chambers, he followed her inside, closing the door firmly behind them. The moment they were alone, the regal mask he wore in public slipped away, revealing the man beneath the crown. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, moving to pour wine from a crystal decanter on the side table. "I should have prepared you better for tonight, should have anticipated how they would react." Alara shook her head emphatically, touching his arm to draw his attention. When he looked at her, she pressed her hand to her heart and then to his, trying to convey that she didn't blame him, that she was grateful for his protection and support. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace," he continued, offering her a goblet of deep red wine. "Many nobles twice your age would have crumbled under such scrutiny." She accepted the wine gratefully, using the familiar ritual of sipping it to steady her nerves. The alcohol warmed her throat, loosened some of the tension that had been coiled in her muscles since the moment Lord Garrett had asked his terrible question. King Lucian moved to stand before the fireplace, his profile etched in gold by the dancing flames. For a long moment, he simply stared into the fire, lost in thoughts she could not fathom. "They will never accept you as you are now," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "The curse makes them see you as weak, as unsuitable for the position you would occupy as my queen. We must find a way to break it completely, to give you back your voice and your power." Queen. The word sent shivers racing down her spine, part terror, part desperate longing. Could she truly be queen? Could a cursed peasant girl learn to command the respect of nobles and the loyalty of subjects? But more importantly, did King Lucian truly see her as his queen, or was she simply a fascinating puzzle to be solved? As if reading her doubts, he turned to face her fully, his silver eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You spoke to me earlier, just 2 words, but they were real. The curse cracked in my presence, Alara. That tells me that whatever bond exists between us is stronger than the dark magic that binds your tongue." He set his wine aside and moved toward her with predatory grace, each step deliberate and purposeful. When he stopped just inches away, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the intoxicating scent of pine and leather, and something uniquely, devastatingly masculine. "Say my name," he commanded softly, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "I know you can do it. I can feel your wolf calling to mine, begging for release. Say my name, Alara." Her lips parted, trembling with the effort of trying to force sound past the barrier that had held for 19 years. She could feel something building in her chest, a pressure that made her heart race and her pulse thunder in her ears. The curse fought against her efforts, tightening around her throat like a noose. But there was something else there too, a crack of light in the absolute darkness, a whisper of hope that grew stronger with each passing second. "Lucian," she breathed, and the name emerged like a prayer, soft and broken, but unmistakably real. The effect on him was immediate and devastating. His eyes blazed with triumph and something deeper, something that made her knees weak and her heart stutter. His thumbs traced the curve of her cheekbones as if she were made of precious crystal, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Gin," he whispered to say it again. "Lucian," she repeated, stronger this time, the syllables rolling off her tongue like honey. Each repetition seemed to weaken the curse's hold, to create larger cracks in the prison that had held her voice captive. And then, before she could lose her courage, before the curse could reassert its dominion, She whispered the words that had been locked in her heart since the moment he first looked at her with those impossibly silver eyes. I think I'm falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them like a spell newly cast, trembling with power and possibility. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the transformation that swept across King Lucien's face, surprise giving way to wonder, wonder deepening into something fierce and possessive that made her wolf whimper with recognition. Alara, he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a benediction. His hand slid from her face to tangle in her hair, disturbing the careful arrangement until auburn waves spilled over her shoulders like liquid fire. Do you have any idea what you're saying, what you're offering? She nodded, her amber eyes never leaving his silver ones. The curse still pressed against her throat like iron bands, but something fundamental had shifted. In his presence, in the sanctuary of his arms, she could speak. Not freely, each word still required tremendous effort, but she could give voice to the feelings that had been locked away for so long. I know, she whispered, her voice hoarse but growing stronger with each syllable. I know it's madness. I know I'm not worthy of a king's love. But when you look at me, I feel whole, complete, like I'm finally who I was meant to be. The confession seemed to unlock something primal in him. His eyes flashed with silver fire, and she caught the faintest glimpse of his wolf rising to the surface. Wild, possessive, utterly uncontrolled. When he spoke, his voice was rough as gravel, edged with the kind of hunger that could devour souls. Not worthy? The words came out as a growl that raised every hair on her body. You think yourself unworthy when you're the first person in 33 years to make me feel anything beyond duty and responsibility? When your voice is the only sound I want to hear for the rest of my life. Before she could process his words fully, he was kissing her with a desperation that bordered on violence. His mouth claimed hers with the authority of a conqueror and the reverence of a supplicant, his lips moving against hers as if he could pour his very soul into the connection between them. She tasted wine and wildness, felt the barely leashed power that thrummed through his body like a caged storm, her hands fisted in the rich fabric of his doublet, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. The kiss was nothing like the gentle, tentative affairs described in the romantic ballads. This was raw and consuming, a claiming that went far deeper than mere physical attraction. She felt something ancient and primal stirring in her chest, her wolf recognizing its mate and crying out in triumph. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alara saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. The air around them seemed to shimmer with unseen energy, charged with the power of a bond that was only beginning to unfold. Mate, he whispered, the word carrying the weight of destiny. I should have known the moment I saw you. My wolf has been restless for months, searching for something I couldn't name. But it was you, it was always you. The revelation sent shockwaves through her entire being. True mates were the stuff of legend, bonds so rare that most wolves lived entire lifetimes without experiencing them. The idea that she, cursed, voiceless, cast aside by her own people, could be destined for the most powerful alpha in the known world seemed impossible. But how, she managed to ask, her voice barely more than a whisper. I'm nobody, a peasant with nothing to offer but... Stop. The command was gentle but implacable, his finger pressing against her lips to silence her protests. You are not nobody. You are brave enough to endure 19 years of cruelty without breaking. Strong enough to hold your head high when lesser souls would have shattered. Beautiful enough to make me forget my own name when I look at you. You are everything, Alara, everything I never dared to hope for. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but for once they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. To hear such words from him, to see the absolute conviction in his eyes, was more healing than 1,000 spells could have been. The broken places in her heart that she had learned to live with began to mend, sealed with the golden light of his faith in her. The curse, she said softly, touching her throat where the invisible bonds still held her voice captive. It only breaks when I'm with you. What does that mean? Lucien's expression grew thoughtful, his analytical mind already working through the implications. True mate bonds are said to be stronger than any magic, capable of breaking even the darkest curses. If your voice returns in my presence, it means our bond is already beginning to form. The more it strengthens, the weaker the curse becomes. Hope bloomed in her chest like a flower reaching for sunlight. Then it could actually be broken? Completely? I believe so. His thumb traced the curve of her lower lip, and she shivered at the gentle contact. But it will take time. Bonds like ours don't form overnight. They require trust, intimacy, the gradual merging of two souls into one. The curse will fight us every step of the way, but love is stronger than hate, Ilara, always. The word love hung between them, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. She had whispered of falling in love with him, but to hear him speak of it with such certainty made her heart race with a mixture of elation and panic. Could she truly be worthy of such devotion? Could she learn to be the queen he needed, the partner he deserved? As if sensing her internal struggle, Lucian pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her with protective tenderness. I know you're afraid, he murmured against her hair. I know this seems too good to be true, but I felt our bond snap into place the moment I saw you on that auction block. Broken and beautiful and defiant. You called to something in me that I thought was dead, awakened parts of my soul I didn't know existed. She nestled against his chest, breathing in his scent and letting his strength anchor her to this impossible moment. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with her own, until she couldn't tell where he ended, and she began. Tell me about the curse, he said quietly. How it happened, who cast it. If we're going to break it, I need to understand what we're fighting. Ilara stiffened in his arms, memories she had tried to bury for years clawing their way to the surface. The night her voice was stolen had been the worst of her life, a trauma so profound it had shaped everything that came after. But if sharing that pain could help him, help her, she would find the courage to speak of it. I was 5 years old, she began, her voice barely audible even in the quiet of the chamber, living with my guardian in a cottage on the edge of Ravens Hollow. She was kind but frail, dying of a wasting sickness that the healers couldn't cure. Lucian's arms tightened around her, offering silent support as she struggled with the memories. 3 witches came to our door one night during a terrible storm. They claimed to be traveling healers, begged for shelter until the weather cleared. My guardian, being the gentle soul she was, welcomed them in despite our poverty, fed them our last loaf of bread, gave them her own bed while she slept on the floor. The irony was still bitter after all these years, kindness repaid with cruelty, hospitality rewarded with destruction. They stayed for 3 days, Ilara continued, her voice growing stronger as anger began to overcome pain. On the 3rd night, I woke to find them standing around my bed, chanting in a language I'd never heard. Their eyes were black as midnight, and there was something hungry about them. Malevolent. I tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. She felt Lucian's body go rigid with fury, felt the rumble of a suppressed growl vibrating through his chest. His wolf was responding to the threat against his mate, even one that was 19 years past. By morning they were gone, she whispered, and my voice with them. My guardian wept for days, blamed herself for trusting strangers. She spent what little money we had trying to find a cure, consulted every healer and wise woman for miles around. But the curse was too strong, too deeply rooted. When she died 2 years later, I was left alone with my silence. Did the witches give any reason? Lucian asked, his voice deadly quiet. Any explanation for why they would curse an innocent child? Ilara shook her head against his chest. The villagers whispered that it was because I was too beautiful, too pure. That dark magic feeds on light, and they wanted to extinguish mine before it could grow too bright. Others said I was simply convenient, a powerless child whose suffering would strengthen their spells. The explanation had never made complete sense to her, but then again, evil rarely did. Some people took pleasure in causing pain for its own sake, and witches who dealt in curses were seldom motivated by logic or justice. We'll find them, Lucian said with quiet certainty. When your voice is fully restored, when you're strong enough to face them, we'll track down these witches and make them pay for what they stole from you. No one hurts my mate and lives to celebrate it. The promise was delivered with such cold fury that Alara shivered, though not with fear. There was something darkly satisfying about the idea of those three malevolent creatures facing the wrath of the Alpha King. They had stolen 19 years of her life, condemned her to isolation and mockery and despair. Perhaps it was time they learned that their actions had consequences. But before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door shattered the intimate atmosphere between them. Lucian's head snapped up, his expression shifting from tender lover to dangerous predator in the space of a heartbeat. "Enter," he called out, his arms still protective around Alara's waist. Sir Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face grim with whatever news he bore. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Commander Aldrich requests your immediate presence. We've received word from the eastern border. The Blackwood Pack has struck again. This time they've taken Millbrook Village." The blood drained from Lucian's face. Millbrook was one of the largest settlements on the eastern border, home to nearly 300 souls. If the Blackwood Pack had taken it, the implications were staggering. "Casualties?" he asked sharply, already moving toward where his weapons hung on the wall. "Unknown, Your Majesty. The messenger barely escaped with his life. But if the pattern holds—" Sir Marcus trailed off, but the implication was clear. The Blackwood Pack didn't take prisoners. They took slaves, food, and whatever valuables they could carry. Everyone else was left dead. Alara felt ice forming in her veins as she watched Lucian transform before her eyes. The gentle man who had held her so tenderly was disappearing, replaced by the warrior king who had earned his throne through blood and steel. When he turned back to her, his silver eyes were cold as winter storms. "I have to go," he said, and she could hear the regret in his voice despite his kingly composure. "My people are dying while I play at romance." The words cut deeper than he probably intended, reducing their profound connection to mere dalliance. Alara knew he didn't mean it that way. Duty was calling, and a good king always answered. But the timing felt cruel, ripping away the first happiness she had known in years just as she was beginning to believe in it. "How long?" she asked, her voice already growing weaker as the reality of separation set in. "I don't know." He strapped on his sword with practiced efficiency, the familiar weight of it settling against his hip like an old friend. "Days, perhaps weeks. The Blackwood Pack is large and well organized. This won't be a simple raid. It will be war." War. The words sent fear lancing through her heart. She had just found him, just begun to understand what they could be together, and now he was riding off to face an enemy that had already proven their ruthlessness. What if he didn't come back? What if she lost him before they had a chance to explore the bond between them? "Take me with you," she said impulsively, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Lucian's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with what looked almost like anger. "Absolutely not." "War is no place for—" "For what?" Alara interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. "A woman? An Omega? Someone who can't defend herself?" "For someone I love," he said quietly, the simple admission hitting her like a physical blow. "I can't lead a war knowing you're in danger, Alara. I need to know you're safe, protected behind these walls where nothing can touch you." The rational part of her mind knew he was right. She had no weapons training, no experience with violence beyond the casual cruelty of village life. She would be a liability in battle, a distraction he couldn't afford when lives hung in the balance. But her heart rebelled against the idea of being left behind like a pretty ornament, waiting helplessly while he risked everything to protect his people. She wanted to be his partner in all things, not just a beautiful burden to be hidden away when real work needed doing. "I could help," she insisted, though even she wasn't sure how. "My voice grows stronger around you. Maybe I could do something useful." The look he gave her was full of tender exasperation, as if she were a beloved child suggesting she could slay dragons with a wooden sword. "Your voice is precious to me, but it won't stop a Blackwood warrior's blade. Promise me you'll stay here, where you're safe. Promise me you'll be waiting when I return." The plea in his voice undid her completely. This wasn't a king commanding a subject. This was a man begging the woman he loved to stay out of harm's way. How could she refuse him that peace of mind when he was riding off to face death itself? "I promise," she whispered, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. Relief flickered across his features, followed quickly by something that might have been regret. He crossed to her in 3 quick strides, pulling her against him with desperate intensity. "I don't want to leave you," he murmured against her hair. "Not now, not when we're just beginning to understand what we are to each other." "Then come back to me," she replied, her voice breaking with emotion. "Come back to me whole and safe, and we'll have all the time in the world." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face with infinite care. "When I return, we'll complete the mating bond properly. I'll make you my queen in truth, not just in my heart. Can you wait for me that long?" Queen. Even terrified as she was for his safety, the words sent thrills racing through her entire being. To be his in every way, bound to him by ties stronger than law or custom, it was everything she had dreamed of and never dared to hope for. "Forever if necessary," she breathed, meaning every word. The kiss he gave her then was fierce and claiming, a brand that marked her as his own. She could taste the promise in it, the vow to return no matter what obstacles stood in his way. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their wolves crying out in protest at the coming separation. "Stay safe," he commanded, pressing one last kiss to her forehead. "Trust no one completely except Marta and Sir Marcus. The court is full of vipers who will see my absence as an opportunity to strike." The warning sent ice through her veins, but she nodded her understanding. Lady Vivian's beautiful, calculating face rose in her mind, along with the faces of all the nobles who had looked at her with such disdain during dinner. Without Lucian's protection, she would be vulnerable to their schemes and machinations. "I'll be careful," she promised, though they both knew how little protection caution could provide against truly determined enemies. With visible effort, Lucian released her and strode toward the door where Sir Marcus waited. At the threshold, he paused and looked back, his silver eyes burning with all the words they didn't have time to say. "I love you," he said simply, the declaration hanging in the air like a sacred vow. "I love you too," she whispered back, her voice barely audible but carrying all the weight of her heart. And then he was gone, the sound of his boots on stone fading into the distance as he went to gather his army. Alara sank into the chair by the fire, suddenly feeling more alone than she had in years. The chambers that had felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a prison, beautiful but confining. Outside her window, she could hear the sounds of preparation. Horses being saddled, weapons being sharpened, orders being shouted as the castle prepared for war. Dawn was still hours away, but there was no chance of sleep now. Not when the man she loved was riding toward danger, and she was left behind to face whatever schemes his enemies might devise. But as she sat in the flickering firelight, one thought burned bright in her mind. Lucian had called her his mate, his queen, the woman he loved. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever enemies sought to destroy her, she would endure them all for the chance to see him again. The curse had taken her voice, but it could not take her heart, and her heart belonged to the Wolf King. Now and always. The first week after Lucian's departure passed in a haze of anxious waiting. Alara threw herself into learning everything she could about being a queen, studying the histories of the realm, memorizing the names and holdings of every noble family, practicing the intricate dances that would be expected at formal gatherings. Marta proved to be an invaluable teacher, patient and encouraging as she guided Alara through the maze of courtly expectations. But no amount of preparation could have readied her for the subtle warfare that began on the 8th day. It started with small things, servants who suddenly became forgetful about bringing her meals on time, invitations to social gatherings that somehow never reached her chambers, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she appeared. The noble ladies who had been coolly polite in Lucian's presence now barely acknowledged her existence, treating her like an embarrassing mistake that would soon be corrected. Lady Vivian, however, took a different approach entirely. Lady Alara, the silver-blonde beauty, swept into the castle's solar, where Alara was attempting to embroider, her silk gown rustling like serpent scales. "How lovely to find you here. I do hope you're not finding the days too terribly long without His Majesty's attention." The word was delivered with just enough emphasis to make its double meaning clear. Alara looked up from her needlework, meeting Lady Vivian's ice-blue gaze with as much composure as she could muster. Without Lucian's presence to unlock her voice, she was once again trapped in silence, forced to communicate through gestures and expressions. "Oh, but how thoughtless of me," Lady Vivian continued with false sympathy, settling gracefully into the chair across from Alara. "You can't actually respond, can you? How limiting that must be, especially for someone in your rather precarious position." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Alara set down her embroidery hoop, her hands steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. She had known this confrontation would come eventually. Lady Vivian was too ambitious and too proud to accept defeat gracefully. "I've been thinking about our conversation at dinner," the noblewoman continued, her voice honey-sweet with false concern, "about suitable matches for our dear king. It occurs to me that perhaps you don't fully understand the gravity of your situation." Lady Vivian leaned forward, her perfect features arranged in an expression of maternal concern that didn't reach her calculating eyes. "You see, my dear, being king's paramour is one thing. Men have their appetites, after all. But queen, that requires bloodline, education, political acumen, the ability to command respect and negotiate treaties. Tell me, how exactly does one negotiate a trade agreement when one cannot speak?" Each word was a precisely aimed dagger designed to cut away at Alara's confidence, piece by piece. The worst part was that some of what Lady Vivian said was true. Alara did lack the noble breeding and political education that would traditionally qualify someone for the throne. But she also remembered Lucian's words about her strength, her courage, her worthiness of his love. "Of course," Lady Vivian continued when Alara made no response, "there are ways to resolve this unfortunate situation with minimal embarrassment for all involved. A quiet retreat to a convent, perhaps, or a marriage to some minor lord who wouldn't mind a damaged wife. I'm sure His Majesty would be generous in providing a dowry, grateful that you'd stepped aside so gracefully." The suggestion hit Alara like a physical blow. Lady Vivian was essentially offering to buy her off, to remove her from the playing field in exchange for a comfortable but meaningless life in exile. It was a clever move, appearing generous while actually delivering the cruelest possible insult. But before Alara could formulate any kind of response, even a gesture of refusal, another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Lady Vivian, how unexpected to find you here." Both women turned to see Lord Commander Aldrich standing in the doorway, his weathered face set in carefully neutral lines. The old soldier's presence filled the room with authority, and Alara felt some of her tension ease. Lucian had mentioned that Aldrich was one of the few people at court she could trust completely. "Lord Commander?" Lady Vivian rose gracefully, her mask of false sweetness never slipping. "I was just keeping Lady Alara company during these difficult days. The poor dear seems rather isolated without His Majesty's presence." Aldrich's gray eyes flicked between the two women, and Alara was certain he could read the undercurrents of tension in the room. When he spoke, his voice was deceptively mild. "How thoughtful of you. Though I'm sure Lady Alara appreciates that His Majesty's instructions regarding her comfort and safety are being followed to the letter." He was quite specific about how any discourtesy toward her would be received upon his return. The reminder of Lucian's protection hung in the air like a sword over Lady Vivian's head. Her smile became a fraction more strained, though her composure remained otherwise perfect. "Naturally," she replied smoothly, "we all serve the crown's wishes, though one does wonder how long such arrangements will remain in effect. Wars have a way of changing many things, don't they?" The implication was clear. If Lucian didn't return from the campaign against the Blackwood Pack, Alara's protection would die with him. Lady Vivian was essentially threatening her while hiding behind plausible deniability, confident that a mute peasant girl couldn't effectively defend herself or report the conversation to anyone who mattered. But she had underestimated Lord Commander Aldrich's loyalty and perception. "Indeed they do," he agreed with deceptive calm. "Though His Majesty has survived many campaigns, and his enemies have a habit of underestimating both his strength and the loyalty he inspires. I wouldn't advise anyone to make plans based on his potential absence. Such plans have a way of backfiring spectacularly." The two nobles stared at each other for a long moment, engaging in the kind of verbal chess match that pass for conversation among the powerful. Finally, Lady Vivian conceded the field with another perfect curtsy. Of course, Lord Commander. How foolish of me to suggest otherwise. Lady Alara, do forgive me for monopolizing your time. I'm sure you have many important matters to attend to. The dismissal was couched in politeness, but the insult was clear. What important matters could a voiceless woman possibly have to occupy her time? Lady Vivian glided from the solar with feline grace, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the lingering taste of threats. When she was gone, Lord Commander Aldrich moved to the window, ostensibly checking the view, but actually ensuring they were truly alone. Only when he was satisfied did he turn back to Alara, his expression softening with genuine concern. Are you unharmed, my lady? Lady Vivian has a gift for making her cruelty sound like kindness, but I could see she was upsetting you. Alara nodded gratefully, touched by his consideration. She gestured toward the chair Lady Vivian had vacated, then mimed the woman's false sweetness before making a throat-cutting motion that conveyed her true opinion of the encounter. Aldrich's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. Aye, she's a viper in silk, that one. Been circling His Majesty like a hawk for years, convinced that her beauty and breeding give her a claim to the throne. Your arrival has upset all her carefully laid plans. He moved to pour wine from a crystal decanter, offering Alara a goblet before taking one for himself. The gesture was respectful but also protective. Claiming the right to share wine with her established her status as someone worthy of his attention and consideration. I won't lie to you, Lady Alara, he continued after taking a sip. The next few weeks will be challenging. With His Majesty away, the vultures will circle, testing your resolve and looking for weaknesses they can exploit. Lady Vivian is just the beginning. She has allies among the court who share her belief that you're unfit for the position you have been offered. The honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. Alara appreciated that he wasn't trying to shield her from reality, but the scope of what she faced was daunting. How could she defend herself against people who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of political warfare? As if reading her thoughts, Aldrich leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. But you have advantages they don't understand. His Majesty didn't choose you on a whim. He recognized something in you that they're blind to. Strength that doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Courage that doesn't need words to make itself known. He paused, studying her face with the intensity of a man who had spent decades reading people's true natures. There's something else, he said quietly. Something I think you should know. We've received word from the eastern border. The king's forces have engaged the Blackwood Pack in battle. The fighting has been intense. Alara's blood turned to ice in her veins. She set down her wine with trembling hands, her amber eyes wide with fear and desperate for more information. He lives, Aldrich said quickly, seeing her panic. The reports confirm he was seen on the battlefield, leading the charge against their alpha. But he hesitated, clearly debating how much to tell her. But, she wanted to scream, her hands clenching into fists as frustration at her voicelessness overwhelmed her. But the Blackwood Pack is larger than we initially believed. They've been gathering rogues and outcasts for months, building an army of wolves with nothing left to lose. This won't be over quickly, and the casualties on both sides have been significant. The carefully chosen words told her everything she needed to know. Lucian was fighting for his life against overwhelming odds, and she was trapped here playing politics with vipers while the man she loved bled for his kingdom. There's more, Aldrich continued reluctantly. The messenger brought disturbing news about the Blackwood Alpha, a creature called Fenris the Bloodthirsty. He's reportedly massive, even for an alpha, and completely without mercy. Some say he's made dark pacts to increase his power, that he's more demon than wolf now. The description sent chills racing down Alara's spine. She had heard whispers of such creatures in the old stories. Alphas who had traded their humanity for raw power, becoming monsters that even other wolves feared. If Lucian was facing such a creature, unable to bear the tension any longer, Alara stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the mountains where somewhere beyond her sight, the man she loved was fighting for his life. Her reflection stared back from the glass. A woman who looked regal in her fine gown and jewels, but whose eyes were haunted with helplessness and fear. Behind her, she heard Aldrich rise from his chair, his footsteps approaching with careful respect. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "He will return to you, my lady. I've served 3 kings in my lifetime, and I've never seen one with Lucian's combination of strength, intelligence, and sheer bloody-minded determination. He has too much to live for now, too much to return to." The words were meant to comfort, but they only highlighted her own uselessness in this situation. While Lucian risked everything to protect his people, she was reduced to waiting helplessly, vulnerable to the machinations of enemies who saw her silence as weakness to be exploited. But as she stood there, watching the sun set over the mountains that separated her from the man she loved, Alara felt something stirring in her chest. Not just fear and longing, but anger, white-hot fury at her own powerlessness, at the curse that had stolen her voice and left her defenseless when she was needed most. Lady Vivienne thought her weak because she couldn't speak. The other nobles dismissed her because she lacked their breeding and education. Even Lucian, despite his love for her, had left her behind like a precious ornament to be protected rather than a partner to be trusted with real responsibilities. But they were all wrong. The curse had taken her voice, but it had also forged her spirit in fires that none of them could imagine. She had survived 19 years of cruelty and isolation, had endured mockery and hatred without breaking. She was stronger than they knew, stronger than she had known herself. The realization crystallized in her mind like ice forming on still water. She couldn't help Lucian on the battlefield, couldn't wield sword or bow in his defense, but she could protect what he had left behind. She could learn to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, could find ways to contribute that didn't require a voice. Most importantly, she could stop being a victim. "Lord Commander," she said, turning from the window with new determination blazing in her amber eyes. She couldn't speak aloud without Lucian's presence, but she had other ways of communicating. Moving to a nearby desk, she pulled out parchment and quill, writing in the careful script that her guardian had taught her years ago. "I need to learn to fight, not with sword or bow. I understand I lack the time and training for such things, but I need to learn to protect myself and others in ways that don't require a voice. Will you help me?" Aldrich read the note, his eyebrows rising in surprise. When he looked up at her, there was something new in his expression. Respect, perhaps even approval. "What did you have in mind, my lady?" "Lady Vivienne threatened me today, and she won't be the last. I can't depend on others to protect me forever. Eventually, I'll need to stand on my own. Teach me about court politics, about the noble families and their allegiances. Help me understand how to read people's true motivations, how to defend myself against verbal attacks even without words." She paused, then added one more line that made Aldrich's eyes widen. "And teach me about poisons. If someone tries to hurt me or those under my protection, I want to be able to respond in kind." The old soldier stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant when he stopped seeing her as a helpless victim to be protected and started seeing her as a potential ally to be reckoned with. "You know," he said slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "I think His Majesty chose even better than he knew." "Very well, Lady Alara. Your education begins tonight, but I warn you, the lessons I teach won't be gentle or easy. Court warfare is every bit as brutal as the battlefield, just with more subtle weapons." "I understand," she wrote. "I'm ready." As she set down the quill, Alara felt a strange sense of liberation wash over her. For the first time in her life, she was choosing to fight rather than simply endure. The curse still bound her voice, but it could not bind her spirit or her determination. Lady Vivienne wanted a war. She would have one, but it would be fought on Alara's terms, with weapons the noble-born viper never saw coming. The mute peasant girl was gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The Wolf King's mate had finally bared her teeth. 3 weeks into her education with Lord Commander Aldrich, Alara had learned that the court of Shadowmere was far more dangerous than any battlefield. At least in war, enemies announced themselves with drawn steel and battle cries. Here they smiled while sliding daggers between your ribs, offered wine laced with more than grape, and spoke words that could destroy reputations with surgical precision. Lady Rosalind of Thornwick is having an affair with Lord Marcus of Goldenhall, Aldrich explained as they walked through the castle's herb gardens, ostensibly admiring the late autumn blooms. Her husband knows but tolerates it because Lord Marcus controls 3 major trade routes. Meanwhile, Lord Marcus's wife is funding a plot to discredit him through his bastard children, of which there are at least 7 that we know of. Alara nodded, filing away the information with dozens of other scandalous secrets that Aldrich had revealed over the past weeks. Every noble family had skeletons in their closets, alliances that could shift with the wind, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those clever enough to recognize them. Knowledge is your weapon now, he had told her on that first night. In a court where words are everything, the person who knows the most dangerous secrets holds the real power. She had proven to be an excellent student, her years of silent observation serving her well. Unable to speak, she had learned to read people's faces, their body language, the subtle tells that revealed their true thoughts. What Aldrich was teaching her was simply a more sophisticated version of skills she had been developing all her life. But it was the poison lessons that had surprised them both. "Your hands are remarkably steady," Aldrich observed, as Alara carefully measured drops of oleander extract into a small vial. They were in his private study, the heavy curtains drawn against prying eyes, working by candlelight that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "And your memory for recipes is exceptional. You've mastered in weeks what takes most apprentices months to learn." "Perhaps because I understand what it feels like to be helpless," she wrote in response. "I never want to feel that way again." The old soldier studied her face in the flickering light, seeing something there that made him nod with grim approval. "Good. That anger will keep you alive when gentler emotions fail you. But remember, poison is a tool to be used sparingly and with precision. It's the weapon of last resort, not first response." Alara understood the distinction. She had no desire to become a monster, but she also refused to remain a victim. The various toxins and antidotes she was learning could protect her and those under her care when more conventional defenses failed. She was just sealing the vial when urgent knocking echoed through the study. Aldrich moved swiftly to hide their work while Alara arranged herself in a chair with an innocent book of poetry. Only when everything appeared normal did he call for entry. Sir Marcus burst through the door, his usually composed face flushed with exertion and barely contained excitement. "Lord Commander, forgive the intrusion, but riders have arrived from the eastern border. They bear urgent news from His Majesty." Alara's heart leaped into her throat. News from Lucien, but was it victory or tragedy that had sent messengers racing through the night? She set aside her book with trembling hands, her amber eyes fixed on Sir Marcus's face as if she could read the truth written there. "Bring them to the Great Hall immediately," Aldrich commanded, already moving toward his weapons, "and summon the senior staff. If this news is what I think it is, we'll need to act quickly." "What kind of news?" Alara wanted to scream, but of course no sound emerged. She could only follow as they hurried through corridors that suddenly seemed endless, her silk slippers silent on the stone floors. The Great Hall was already filling with nobles who had somehow learned of the messenger's arrival despite the late hour. Word travels fast in Shadowmere, especially when it concerned their king's fate. Alara saw Lady Vivian near the front of the crowd, her perfect features arranged in an expression of concern that didn't reach her calculating eyes. The messenger who stepped forward was a young knight she didn't recognize, his armor battered and stained with mud and worse things. His face was haggard with exhaustion, but his eyes blazed with the fierce joy of victory. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "I bring word from His Majesty, King Lucien Nightfall, by the grace of the gods, ruler of the northern realms and alpha of all wolves within our borders." The formal address sent relief flooding through Alara's body. If Lucien were dead, the messenger would have begun with news of succession, not royal proclamations. "The Blackwood Pack has been defeated," the knight continued, and cheers erupted throughout the hall. "Their alpha, Fenris the Bloodthirsty, is dead by His Majesty's own hand. The surviving members of the pack have scattered to the winds, no longer a threat to our lands or people." More cheers, stamping feet, and calls for celebration. But Alara noticed that the messenger's expression remained grim despite his announcement of victory. There was more news coming, and not all of it would be joyful. However, he continued once the noise had died down. The battle was costly. Many brave warriors gave their lives in defense of the realm. His Majesty was gravely wounded in his final confrontation with the enemy Alpha, though the royal physicians report he will recover fully given time and proper care. The word wounded hit Alara like a physical blow. Her vision blurred at the edges, and she had to grip the stone pillar beside her to keep from swaying. Lucian was alive but hurt. How badly? The messenger spoke of recovery, but royal proclamations had a way of minimizing disasters to prevent panic. The king has requested that preparations be made for his return, the messenger concluded. He rides for Shadowmere with all possible speed, though his injuries may require him to travel slowly. He should arrive within a fortnight, the gods willing. A fortnight. 14 days of not knowing the true extent of his wounds, of imaging the worst while hoping for the best. Alara closed her eyes and tried to draw strength from the mate bond that connected them across the miles. Somewhere in the darkness of her mind, she could sense him, distant but unmistakably alive, like a candle flame flickering in the wind, but refusing to be extinguished. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the victory and speculating about the king's condition, Lord Commander Aldrich appeared at her elbow. His weathered face was thoughtful as he studied the lingering nobles. "Interesting," he murmured quietly. "Notice who looks genuinely relieved by the news and who seems disappointed." Following his gaze, Alara saw what he meant. Most of the nobles appeared happy that their king lived and had won a great victory, but a few faces showed different emotions: calculation, frustration, even anger barely masked by polite smiles. These were people who had been hoping for different news, who had perhaps made plans based on Lucian's potential death. Lady Vivian was among them, her ice-blue eyes glittering with barely concealed fury as she processed the implications of the messenger's announcement. For 3 weeks, she had been maneuvering as if Lucian's absence might become permanent. Now she would have to adjust her schemes to account for his return and his continued protection of the woman she saw as her greatest rival. "The next 2 weeks will be crucial," Aldrich continued, steering Alara toward a quieter corner of the hall. "His Majesty's enemies will see this as their last chance to act before he returns. They'll be desperate, which makes them unpredictable and extremely dangerous." "What kind of action?" Alara wrote quickly on a piece of parchment she had learned to carry for such conversations. "Against you, primarily," he replied bluntly. "If they can't eliminate or discredit you before he returns, they'll lose their opportunity to influence his choice of queen. Expect the attacks to escalate dramatically in the coming days." The warning sent ice through her veins, but also steel into her spine. Let them come, she thought fiercely. She was no longer the helpless peasant girl who had cowered on an auction block. 3 weeks of intensive education had armed her with knowledge, skills, and most importantly, confidence in her own abilities. "I'm ready for them," she wrote, and meant every word. Aldrich read the note and smiled, not the gentle, protective expression he had worn when she was purely a victim to be shielded, but the fierce grin of a warrior recognizing a kindred spirit. "Good," he said simply, "because it begins tonight." As if his words had been prophecy, a commotion erupted near the Great Hall's entrance, shouting voices, the clatter of metal on stone, and then a woman's scream that cut through the chaos like a blade. Everyone in the hall turned toward the disturbance, nobles pressing forward to see what was happening. Through the crowd, Alara caught glimpses of a struggle, guards restraining someone, though she couldn't see who. Then the crowd parted slightly, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. Marta, her faithful servant and teacher, was being dragged through the hall in chains. The elderly woman's gray hair was disheveled, her dress torn, and there were dark bruises blooming across her face that spoke of rough handling. But it was her eyes that made Alara's heart break, wide with terror and confusion, darting desperately through the crowd as if looking for someone who could save her from this nightmare. "What is the meaning of this?" Lord Commander Aldrich's voice cut through the noise like a sword through silk. The guards stopped their rough handling of Marta, though they didn't release her. Captain Thorn, the head of the castle guard, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. Alara had met him several times and found him to be an honorable man. The fact that he looked deeply uncomfortable with his current duty was almost as alarming as the situation itself. "Lord Commander," he said formally, "I arrest this woman on charges of treason against the crown. She stands accused of attempting to poison Lady Alara on orders from agents of the Blackwood Pack." The accusation hit the assembled nobles like a thunderbolt. Gasps echoed through the hall, followed immediately by excited whispers as people processed the implications. Someone had tried to poison the king's chosen lady, and her most trusted servant was the accused traitor. But Alara knew it was impossible. Marta had been nothing but kind and loyal since her arrival at Shadowmere. The woman had taught her court etiquette, helped her navigate the treacherous waters of noble society, and become something approaching a mother figure in the weeks since Lucian's departure. The idea that she would betray such trust was absurd. "This is a lie," she wrote frantically, showing the note to Aldrich. "Marta would never." "What evidence supports these charges?" Aldrich interrupted, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes blazing with anger. Captain Thorne produced a small vial filled with clear liquid. This was found hidden in the accused woman's quarters, along with a letter detailing the plot. The poison is tasteless and odorless. It would have killed Lady Alara within hours if administered successfully. Alara stared at the vial in horror. The glass was similar to those she had been using in her own poison lessons with Aldrich, but she knew she had accounted for every drop of toxin in their private stores. This was not one of their carefully measured preparations. This was something else entirely. "May I examine the letter?" Aldrich requested, extending his hand with apparent calm. Captain Thorne hesitated, glancing towards someone in the crowd before reluctantly producing a piece of parchment. As Aldrich read it, his expression grew darker with each line. "Interesting," he said finally. "This letter claims to be from a Blackwood Pack survivor, offering gold in exchange for Lady Alara's death. The handwriting is remarkably similar to other correspondence I've seen." He looked directly at Lady Vivian as he spoke, and Alara saw the noblewoman's perfect composure slip for just an instant. It was enough to confirm what she had already suspected. This was a frame job, a desperate attempt to remove Alara's protection before Lucian's return. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things entirely. "The evidence seems clear," Lady Vivian said smoothly, stepping forward with an expression of shocked concern. "How terrible that someone so trusted could harbor such treachery. Poor Lady Alara, she must be devastated by this betrayal." The false sympathy was masterfully delivered, designed to appear supportive while actually highlighting Alara's supposed gullibility and poor judgment. If Marta was executed as a traitor, it would cast doubt on Alara's fitness to judge character, a crucial quality for any queen. "She's innocent," Alara wrote desperately, showing the note to Captain Thorne. "This is a plot to frame her." The captain read her protest with obvious discomfort. "My lady, I understand your loyalty to your servant, but the evidence—" "What evidence?" The new voice came from the crowd, sharp with authority and barely contained fury. The nobles parted to reveal Sir Marcus pushing through their ranks, his young face blazing with indignation. "Sir Marcus," Captain Thorne acknowledged warily, "you should not involve yourself in—" "I should not involve myself in the framing of an innocent woman," the young knight interrupted. "I've known Marta since I was a boy, Captain. She served my own family before coming to Shadowmere. The idea that she would commit treason is as absurd as suggesting I would." His testimony carried weight. Sir Marcus was well respected among the nobility, his word difficult to dismiss. But Lady Vivian was too experienced a player to be defeated so easily. "How touching that Sir Marcus defends his old family retainer," she said with a smile that could have frozen wine. "But surely he cannot dispute physical evidence. The poison was found in her quarters, the letter written in her hand." "Was it?" Sir Marcus challenged. "Have we had handwriting experts examine the letter? Have we questioned how a simple servant would know to contact Blackwood survivors, or how she would obtain such sophisticated poison?" The questions were devastating in their logic, poking holes in the hastily constructed frame job. Alara felt a surge of gratitude toward the young knight, even as she recognized the courage it took for him to challenge the unspoken consensus of the court. But Lady Vivian had one more card to play. Perhaps, she suggested with false reluctance, we should consider the possibility that Lady Alara herself was involved in this plot. After all, who better to deflect suspicion than the supposed target? The accusation sent shocked gasps through the crowd. To suggest that Alara had orchestrated her own assassination attempt was breathtakingly audacious and brilliantly calculated. It cast doubt on her innocence, while positioning her as either a co-conspirator or a manipulative schemer willing to sacrifice a loyal servant to maintain her cover. Alara felt the walls closing in around her. Without a voice to defend herself, without Lucian's protection to shield her from such attacks, she was vulnerable to any accusation that seemed plausible to the watching nobles. Already she could see doubt creeping into some faces, the poison of suspicion spreading through the crowd like wildfire. But then Lord Commander Aldrich stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of granite determination. That, he said quietly, is a very dangerous accusation to make without proof, Lady Vivian. Almost as dangerous as the accusations being made against Marta. I suggest we postpone any decisions until His Majesty returns to sort out this mess personally. It was a masterful move, invoking Lucian's authority to buy time while subtly threatening anyone who continued to push false charges against his chosen lady. But Lady Vivian had clearly expected this response. Of course, she agreed smoothly, though I fear for Lady Alara's safety if the traitor remains free. Perhaps protective custody would be appropriate for all involved? The suggestion was delivered with false concern, but Alara recognized it for what it was, an attempt to isolate both her and Marta, to separate them from their allies and make them more vulnerable to further manipulation or outright elimination. As the nobles continued to debate her fate as if she were a piece on a chessboard rather than a person with feelings and rights, Alara felt rage building in her chest like a wildfire. They thought her weak because she couldn't speak, dismissed her as a victim to be manipulated or eliminated at will. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Moving with deliberate grace, Alara stepped forward into the center of the crowd. Every face turned toward her, nobility and servants alike drawn by the quiet authority in her movements. When she had their complete attention, she did something none of them expected. She smiled. It wasn't a gentle expression of reassurance or a nervous attempt at appeasement. This was the smile of a predator who had finally decided to stop hiding her teeth, cold and sharp and absolutely terrifying in its implications. From the folds of her gown, she produced a small vial of clear liquid, identical to the one that had supposedly been found in Marta's quarters. The crowd gasped as she held it up for all to see, her amber eyes glittering with dangerous amusement. Then, before anyone could stop her, she uncorked the vial and drank its contents in a single swift motion. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Several noble ladies screamed, men shouted in alarm, and Captain Thorne lunged forward as if he could somehow undo what had already been done. Even Lady Vivian's perfect composure cracked, her face going white with what might have been shock or fury. But Alara simply stood there, very much alive and utterly unharmed, her smile growing wider with each passing second. Water, she wrote on a piece of parchment, holding it up for all to see, flavored with mint to mask any potential odor. The same substance that was supposedly found in Marta's quarters. The implications rippled through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. If the poison was fake, then the entire case against Marta was fabricated. And if Alara had known it was fake, that meant she had anticipated the plot and prepared her own countermove. Impossible, Lady Vivian breathed, her mask of concern finally slipping to reveal the calculating fury beneath. How could you have known? Because I know who my real enemies are, Alara wrote, her gaze fixed on the silver-haired beauty with laser intensity. And I've been preparing for them. The silence that followed Alara's revelation was deafening. Every noble in the Great Hall stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The mute peasant girl they had dismissed and underestimated had not only anticipated their schemes but had turned them into a trap for her enemies. Lady Vivian's perfect composure finally shattered completely. Her ice-blue eyes blazed with fury as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. For weeks she had been maneuvering against what she believed was a helpless victim, only to discover she had been dancing to the tune of someone far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "You planned this," she hissed, abandoning all pretense of courtly politeness. "You've been manipulating us all along." Alara tilted her head with predatory grace, her amber eyes glittering with cold amusement. She reached for her writing materials again, but before she could put quill to parchment, the massive doors of the great hall burst open with a sound like thunder. King Lucian Nightfall stood in the doorway like an avenging god, his silver eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. His left arm was bound in a sling, and fresh scars marked his throat and jaw, evidence of his battle with the monstrous Fenris. But despite his injuries, he radiated the same dangerous magnetism that had first captured Alara's heart, his presence filling the vast hall with crackling energy. "What?" he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "Is happening in my hall?" The assembled nobles dropped to their knees as one, pressing their faces to the cold stone in desperate submission. Only Alara remained standing, her heart singing with joy and relief at the sight of him. He was alive. He was here, in the mate bond between them, pulsed with renewed strength across the distance that separated them. Lord Commander Aldrich stepped forward, his weathered face grim with the weight of explanation. "Your Majesty, there have been accusations." "I can see that," Lucian interrupted, his gaze sweeping over the kneeling nobles before fixing on the chained woman cowering between two guards. "Marta, what are the charges against one of my most trusted servants?" "Treason, Your Majesty," Captain Thorn replied reluctantly. "Attempted poisoning of Lady Alara on orders from Blackwood Pact survivors." The king's expression grew dangerously still. When he spoke, his voice carried the promise of violence barely held in check. "And what evidence supports this accusation?" As Captain Thorn began to recite the fabricated evidence, Lucian's eyes found Alara's across the crowded hall. The moment their gazes met, she felt the familiar warmth spreading through her chest, the curse's hold on her voice beginning to crack and weaken. Her lips parted slightly, testing the invisible bonds that had held her silent for so long. "The evidence," Lady Vivian interjected smoothly, rising gracefully from her knees, "seems quite compelling, Your Majesty, though Lady Alara has made some interesting claims about its authenticity." Lucian's head turned toward her with predatory slowness, his silver eyes narrowing as he took in her calculated expression of concern. "Has she? And what exactly has my lady claimed?" The possessive emphasis on "my lady" sent a clear message to everyone present, but Lady Vivian was too committed to her course to retreat now. "She suggests the poison was fake, that the entire plot was fabricated to frame her servant," Lady Vivian replied, her voice honey-sweet with false regret. "Though one must wonder how a woman who cannot speak could have anticipated such an elaborate scheme." The implication hung in the air like a sword over Alara's head. If she couldn't speak, how could she have coordinated her own defense? The suggestion painted her as either complicit in the plot or impossibly prescient, neither of which reflected well on her fitness to be queen. But Lucian's response was not what Lady Vivian expected. He smiled. It was the expression of such cold, predatory satisfaction that several nobles actually whimpered in fear. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute power and the promise of swift retribution. "Cannot speak?" he repeated, his eyes never leaving Alara's face. "My dear Lady Vivian, I think you may be in for a surprise." He strode across the hall with fluid grace, the crowd parting before him like water before the bow of a ship. When he reached Alara, he took her hands in his, and she felt the curse's hold weaken dramatically as their mate bond flared to life. "Tell them," he commanded softly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "Tell them what you know. Show them the woman I chose to be my queen." Alara's breath caught in her throat as she felt something fundamental shift inside her. The curse was still there. She could feel its weight like iron chains around her voice. But Lucian's presence, his faith in her, his love, created cracks in its foundation that grew wider with each passing second. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in 19 years, her voice rang clear and strong in the absolute silence of the great hall. "The poison was indeed fake," she said, her words carrying with crystalline clarity. "Water flavored with mint, substituted for the real toxin that was supposed to kill me. I know because I have spent weeks learning about poisons from Lord Commander Aldrich, preparing for exactly this type of attack. Gasps echoed throughout the hall. The assembled nobles stared at her in shock, their minds struggling to process not just what she had said, but the fact that she could say it at all. The mute peasant girl was speaking, her voice melodious and compelling, commanding attention with an authority that seemed to radiate from her very soul. I anticipated that my enemies would try to strike before King Lucien's return, she continued, her amber eyes sweeping across the crowd with regal dignity. I expected them to target those closest to me, to try to isolate me by turning my allies into suspects. What I did not expect was the sheer clumsiness of their execution. Her gaze fixed on Lady Vivian, who had gone white as winter snow, her perfect features frozen in an expression of dawning horror. The letter allegedly written by Marta was forged, but the forger made crucial mistakes. The handwriting, while similar to Marta's, lacks the slight tremor she has developed in her left hand from years of service. The parchment is too fine, too expensive for a servant to possess. And most tellingly, it references events that occurred after the supposed date of writing. The logic was devastating in its simplicity, each point building upon the last to create an unassailable case for Marta's innocence. But Alara wasn't finished. More importantly, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, the real poison that was supposed to replace the fake was found in Lady Vivian's private chambers this morning, along with correspondence detailing her plan to eliminate me and claim the throne for herself. The accusation hit the assembled nobles like a thunderbolt. All eyes turned to Lady Vivian, who stood frozen in the center of the crowd like a beautiful statue of guilt and fury. "That's impossible," she whispered, her mask of perfection finally slipping completely. "You couldn't have known. You can't prove—" "Can't I?" Alara's smile was razor-sharp, filled with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered her prey. "Lord Commander Aldrich, would you please produce the evidence?" Aldrich stepped forward with obvious satisfaction, producing a leather satchel that contained several vials of genuine poison and a stack of correspondence written in Lady Vivian's unmistakable hand. The letters detailed not just the plot against Alara, but a broader conspiracy involving several noble families who hoped to profit from Lucien's death and the chaos that would follow. "The real poison is far more sophisticated than simple water," Alara explained as the evidence was displayed for all to see. "Extracted from death-cap mushrooms and refined to be both tasteless and fast-acting. Lady Vivian has been planning this assassination for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike." Lady Vivian's composure cracked completely, her beautiful face twisted with rage and desperation as she realized the magnitude of her failure. "You think you've won?" she snarled, abandoning all pretense of nobility. "You think speaking a few words makes you worthy of a crown? You're still nothing but a cursed peasant girl who got lucky." The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Alara felt something deep inside her chest finally snap free. The last chains of the curse shattered like glass, releasing not just her voice but the full power of her spirit that had been locked away for 19 years. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of queens and the power of wolves who had found their true alpha. "You're right about one thing, Lady Vivian. I was cursed. But that curse taught me strength that you could never understand. It taught me to survive when survival seemed impossible, to find hope in the darkest places, to value the love of those who saw worth in me when the world saw only weakness." She stepped forward, her presence suddenly filling the hall with the same commanding energy that Lucien possessed. The nobles who had dismissed her now shrank back, sensing that something fundamental had changed in the woman who stood before them. "I am no longer the frightened girl who was sold on an auction block," she continued, her voice growing more powerful with each word. "I am the woman who survived 19 years of cruelty and came out stronger. I am the mate of the Wolf King, chosen not for political convenience, but for the bond that connects our very souls. And I am the queen you will learn to respect, not because of my bloodline, but because of my strength." The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. This was no longer the silent victim they had known. This was a force of nature, a woman who had been forged in fires hot enough to burn away everything weak and false, leaving only steel and determination. King Lucian's eyes blazed with pride and love as he watched his mate claim her rightful place. When he spoke, his voice carried the finality of royal decree. Lady Vivian Ashford, you stand accused of high treason, attempted murder, and conspiracy against the crown. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and your guilt is clear to all present. Lady Vivian's legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees in the center of the hall. Her perfect beauty was marred by tears of rage and despair as she realized that all her schemes and ambitions had crumbled to dust. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice broken and pleading, "surely there is room for mercy. The same mercy you planned to show my mate." Lucian's voice was cold as Arctic wind. "The same mercy you showed to the innocent woman you tried to frame? I think not." He turned to address the entire assembly, his presence commanding absolute attention. "Let this serve as a warning to any who would threaten what is mine. Lady Alara is my chosen queen, my true mate, and the future mother of my heirs. Any who stand against her stand against me, and they will face the consequences of that choice." The warning was clear and unmistakable. The nobles who had plotted against Alara now faced a terrible choice: submit to her authority or face the wrath of the most powerful alpha in the known world. One by one they knelt before her, offering the respect and allegiance they had previously withheld. Even those who had been part of Lady Vivian's conspiracy bent the knee, recognizing that their only hope of survival lay in throwing themselves on the mercy of the woman they had sought to destroy. But it was Marta's freedom that brought tears to Alara's eyes. The loyal woman fell weeping at her feet, overwhelmed with gratitude for her salvation and amazed by the transformation in the young woman she had served so faithfully. "My queen," she whispered, the title carrying all the weight of absolute devotion. "My friend," Alara replied, helping the older woman to her feet with gentle hands. "Always my friend." As the last of the formalities were concluded and Lady Vivian was led away in chains to await her execution, Lucian finally claimed his mate properly. His good arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against him with possessive tenderness as his lips found hers in a kiss that spoke of love, relief, and promises yet to be fulfilled. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Alara saw her own wonder reflected in his silver eyes. The curse was truly broken. She could feel its absence like the lifting of a great weight from her soul. Her voice was free, her spirit unbound, her future bright with possibility. "My queen," he murmured against her ear, the words carrying all the love and pride and fierce protectiveness that had marked their bond from the very beginning. "My king," she replied, her voice strong and clear and absolutely certain. "My mate, my love." The assembled nobles cheered as their king claimed his queen with another kiss, this one deeper and more passionate than the first. But Alara barely heard them, lost in the sensation of being held by the man who had saved her in every way that mattered. The curse that had stolen her voice was broken at last. The enemies who had sought to destroy her were defeated, and the love that had seemed too beautiful to be real had proven stronger than magic, more powerful than hatred, more enduring than time itself. Lady Alara, once cursed to silence, had finally found her voice, and with it, she would help rule a kingdom, protect those she loved, and face whatever challenges the future might bring. The Wolf King and his queen were complete at last, their bond unbreakable, their love eternal, their reign just beginning.